Welcome to Let's Talk Poverty, the podcast that helps you understand poverty in Calgary through the lens of enough for all. It tackles the stigma surrounding poverty, challenging biases and assumptions. From the voices of lived experience to community members to highlighting raw data, we speak with subject matter and policy experts, community leaders, and you to explore the root causes of poverty in our city and how we can come together to make changes that matter. Let's Talk Poverty is recorded in Treaty 7. The lands of the Blackfoot Nations, the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Welcome to Let's Talk Poverty. I'm Jaclyn Silbernagel, and today I am joined by Jean Boulton, a leading thinker in the field of complexity science and author of The Tao of Complexity. We're going to explore what it means to rethink how the world works, seeing systems as dynamic and relational. And we're going to talk about embracing uncertainty, using narrative and shared sense-making to co-create the future and shifting from quick fixes to deeper systems change in addressing the root causes of things like poverty. Jean, welcome.
Thanks very much. Very, very pleased to be here. Lovely to see you.
So good to have you on the podcast. To help our listeners get to know you a little bit better, I'm just wondering if you could choose 5 words to describe yourself, what would they be?
Yes, I was thinking about this and discovered I'm incapable of saying anything in 5 words. But the 5 thoughts I had was, I'm an activist who believes that our worldviews are absolutely fundamental to going about things differently. So you might call me a worldview activist, someone who wants to rattle the cage of the way you think about the way the world is, the way the world works. So that's my first word, just to show you how... The second word, or the second idea, is that I'm very respectful in my understanding of worldviews, of the perspectives that are honed through experience. And that would include Indigenous wisdom, but the wisdom of all of us that we glean through actually living and being in the world. So this is a kind of theory embedded in experience. I think I'm courageous. I like to think of myself as courageous. And I believe in working not just with the intellect, that the brain is going to give us all the answers, but I think of working with the heart-mind. I think of working in relationship with others and paying real attention to the context and what's going on. So that's the way I kind of perceive of myself, somebody who does things in the world. And the 5th word is I like dogs and walking. So.
Love that. Thank you for that. Now, you released your latest book last year, The Tao of Complexity, Making Sense and Making Waves in Turbulent Times, where you really invite us to see the world differently. So I'm just wondering, to start us off, what is the foundation of complexity science and why does it matter now?
Well, the foundations of complexity science for me started with the work of Ilya Prigogine, who was working in the early 20th century. And he was really exercised by one question, which was, why does physics seem to give us an idea of a world of certainty, a world that can be known through data and measurement and create this kind of certainty and stability, whereas biology and evolution talk about an ever-becoming world that keeps changing and becomes more sophisticated. So physics kind of tells you either things remain the same or in some ways tell you through thermodynamics that things can deteriorate into featureless dust. And biology doesn't seem to say either of those things. And his work, for which he got the Nobel Prize, was recognising that most situations in the social and natural world that are interesting to us are open to their wider environment. And if you study open systems, then you start to find that physics and biology start to have the same ideas about how change happens and how form can emerge locally. So that's rather a technical answer, I think. But what my work has been and why it matters, I think, is that gives us a much richer understanding and a more relevant understanding of how to create change. Management tends to often focus on, let's work out what's going on, and it's about control and prediction and precision. And economics is often about leaving things be, leaving it to the market. Whereas these ideas of complexity science seem to inform us better about how things emerge and change and what we should do in relation to that.
Yeah, I love that. And the relevance of how we work together, I think, becomes quite relational in how we observe ourselves in the world. Complexity asks us to sit with uncertainty, messiness, and constant change, which is definitely something we're all feeling right now. But is there more to it than that?
Yes, I think that what the science of complexity, so it can sound like if I said to my mum, the world is complex, it sounds like a bad thing. And, it sounds, oh, we've got to navigate all this complexity. We've got to put up with it. We don't know what's going on. It feels like that. But what the science of complexity is showing us that the world shows up in terms of patterns of behavior, patterns of relationships. If you're working in an organization, it will have particular culture that's developed over years. It will have particular ways of doing things. If you go and work with a community, the same. If you're going to tackle poverty here or you're going to handle inequality in this situation, then it isn't like you have to know everything about everybody to understand that complexity. You will start to pay attention to the stabilizing patterns. Paradox of complexity, and why it sounds kind of weird, is that it's the very ability for relationships to flex a bit and in ways of doing things to have some diversity and movement and adaptability in it that creates the kind of stability that we often find. So the paradox is that it is the very allowing of movement in situations that allows for adaptation and resilience. So we're not really saying to people, embrace the horrible messiness and get over it. We're saying, look in your situations about what is stable and why, and have a think about what you need to do to either stabilize those things or to change them. Let's understand what's there to start off with. So we pay a sort of dual attention to what's stable, what are those patterns and norms, but also can we spot signs of opportunity or bits that are unraveling or bits that are growing in a new way, indeed take advantage of things that are already starting to destabilize, and actually we think that's a good thing because it's something that perhaps needs to change. So it's not for me, it doesn't feel sort of scary in that sense because I'm more interested in what we can know about the complex world.
That notion of that opportunity in the destabilization, because it's showing us that something needs to change, I think is such an interesting and critical way to look at the world, to ask that question, what is stable and why, and vice versa, what isn't stable and why, and let's look at those opportunities. To your point, though, I think it can feel like a little bit scary or a little bit messy. How do you yourself deal with that sense of uncertainty in the way that the future might unfold?
Well, I like it because it gives me a sense of agency. So it feels to me like I can go into a situation. Maybe I'm using my senses. I've joined a meeting. I'm trying to work out what the vibe is here. What are the ways of doing things? But then can I kind of attune to that and find a way of creating a change? Or can I find a novel way of doing something? Because, that if things are not entirely fixed and certain, and the resilience is actually created by almost like the interweaving of connections. I have a way in, I can have a way to make change, I can bring my creativity and novelty. So I think for me, it feels like a great thing. There's nothing worse, I find, in having to do something where the way of doing it is set out, there's no choice. We're just asked to rock up at work and do what we're being asked to do. So I think paradoxically, I find those very certain situations more depressing than embracing a level of movement that's true. I mean, it's like if I came to visit, if I was a social worker working with your family, if I can embrace and understand the way your family works or your community works, and then start to think, oh, well, let's try this, or let's experiment with this, or, let me see if I can use my skill to intervene in this way. It's kind of generative for both the family and for me, the social worker. So that gives you an example of how for me it's like a good thing.
Yeah, no, I love that. I appreciate that perspective. Now, we're here in Canada, you're in the UK, you've worked across the world. For us, in our work with Vibrant Communities Calgary, Indigenous ways of knowing and being are really important to our work. And I know that you've mentioned it, and you find that Indigenous wisdom shares a lot of common ground with complexity science. And so it makes me think about the interconnectedness of all things, the necessity of relationship, that collective responsibility and co-creation. And of course, narrative storytelling and sense making are a really important part of that tapestry. So if, as you say, the narrative is an important method for knowing about the complex world, I just want to get more of your perspective on how storytelling helps us understand patterns, relationships, and again, those possibilities in a way that just hard data alone can't do.
Just to say a little bit before I answer or explore the question about storytelling, I really do. One of the core ideas in the Tao of Complexity and really energized me to write it was I started with this indigenous wisdom from 5th century BC China, 2,500 years ago, in this book called the Tao Te Ching, and was just blown away by how the worldview, the ideas in it, are almost identical to the ideas that you would get through studying the science of complexity. And I find the same with indigenous wisdom, that as you know, I came across to Banff to the change, the systems. I can't know what it was called now. What's it called?
The System Summit, yes, the
Summit. And the keynote speaker at the beginning was an Indigenous elder, and we were saying the same things, slightly different words, but there was not really a difference in the way we understood the way the world worked and what you have to do. So that's really important. That resonance with those traditions is very important to me, and is kind of embedded in my writing in the book. The role of storytelling, if the world is not as certain as a machine, it isn't like there's one way of doing things, or if we measure what we do here, we can roll it out in other places. If there's more subtlety to it than that, storytelling, both, it has a way, if I get you or a group of people to tell me the story of how their communities developed, or what they see as the ways things are changing, you can actually capture the real minutiae of what really created change. Now, sometimes you might have a number of narratives that you work with, and you're starting to kind of see some differences in emphasis, or sometimes some differences that you'd want to go back to explore. But if you only work with statistics or generalized understandings, it's often the real crucial moments or the detail that you lose that were actually the things that created the change. And again, if you think about your family and what maybe really started, or a group of friends or a community, what really started to shift something, it will be something that's quite surprising or small or different in this situation to that situation. And storytelling allows you to really get much more into the graininess, the richness of change. So I think it's a very important way of knowing. It also has a way of incorporating naturally feelings and thoughts. It's an integrative way of actually working with information. You're already working in an integrative way with the heart mind, with multiple perspectives. And of course, stories are also a way of influencing others. So rather than say to this group over here, we've learnt this about change here, or tackling poverty, take our wisdom and you do it over here. Here's 4 things we did. You can share the story of what you did, and then get them to share the story of what they did. And then you're comparing similarities and differences and finding shared learning. So I think it's a very rich way of working to both know what's going on and to start to share learning and find ways forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I know language itself is so important. I know in the Blackfoot language, there's so much, to your point, so much more meaning in single words that are conveyed. So there's words like the word gimabeetsin means compassion and care. And that's kind of a word that it really sits with me, because there is no word for poverty in Blackfoot. And so, but yet within the language and within the understanding of story is the solution of caring for those around us. And similarly, there's a word called anitopisi, and it talks about the spider web, and kind of how vibrations on the different threads of a spider web, impact the rest of, you feel those vibrations and they impact you and they affect you. It makes me really think about how the world works, right? And how I kind of understand myself and what I can learn from that as well. So yeah, just a very interesting perspective and ability to talk about that, develop that understanding as we seek to understand how change happens and how we want it to change and working in that system.
Yes, and I found that very interesting in the Tao Te Ching, this Chinese book thinking about wisdom in those days. They automatically assumed that compassion and relationships mattered, that, we're either all improving or in a sense no one improves. It's kind of embedded in the philosophy in the same way. And I think what complexity science does in a way is it's more asking the question, what happens if you don't have that? And what happens if you do have that? So in a sense, as a science, it's not, it's neutral. It tells you how bad leads to bad, or, how we get locked in, how inequality becomes very difficult to challenge and unassailable, and gives you ideas about that. But it's not, in a sense, preaching a message. But if you use it as a kind of way of thinking about things, it becomes obvious that compassion relationships is the way that if we care about the future, if we care about the planet, if we care about each other, then that kind of compassion and connection is fundamental to actually creating resilient change. So
Yeah.
with these Indigenous, it was just embedded from the beginning. They didn't separate that from an understanding of the world. It was kind of obviously there, which is so appealing.
And I feel like there's a reintegration of some of that understanding, which we welcome and want to see more of, I think. I guess if the future can't really be predicted, but is always being co-created, what does that mean for how we collectively approach big social challenges like poverty reduction? And can it really help us address the root causes of poverty rather than just the symptoms?
I think one of the things is that we often learn how to do things locally and in its historical and contextual, and with the resources you have locally and with the people and the possibilities you have locally, is often much more effective in tackling social change than trying to do something bigger. We've had an approach, to trying to help people stop smoking. And the approach, which is a kind of one size fits all, is you offer people 6 coaching sessions and give them free patches. And that's it. And of course, what happens is it seems to work because the people who they call the low-hanging fruit, the middle class resourced people who were going to do it anyway, will take that route and manage to stop smoking. So it looks very successful. But as people have said to me, I was working with some of the public health people, and they were saying, yes, but if you're working in a mental health setting, you'll find that half the care workers smoke. The people who are either residents there or coming in for the day have multiple problems. They may have drug and alcohol related problems, mental health problems, as well as smoking. And that's a much more complex issue, that just saying go to 5 coaching sessions and here's a few patches are not going to touch it. So working locally and sometimes working systemically. So something like poverty, in a sense, the determinants of poverty are very wide. So you're working on many issues at once. But if you can do that locally, then you've a chance of, maybe housing is a big issue here. Maybe some, alcoholism, maybe it's, lack of jobs. Can work in a way that works towards the cessation of poverty, but in a much more localized, contextualized way, where budgeting is still tight, but it allows you to use your budget in ways that suit the context for you, so that there's some flexibility there. And I think what needs to be embedded around that is lots of ways of shared learning again. So that what the global does is it works towards identifying intentions. How do we weave intentions that we all understand? Where are we heading for? So that allows us to make choices locally in relation to those intentions and principles and visions. And the other thing that we have to talk about all the same is about almost like what's allowed and what isn't, our sort of moral or ethical stance around that, so what kind of behaviours, what would we do and what wouldn't we do? Can we have a sharing of that in the way that we work? And then I think it's often these kind of changes work better when there's evidence from local settings, they've shared learning, there's a kind of pushing upwards then, which moves towards, where funding comes from, policy changes, legislative changes, that if they're informed by that kind of practice, often work much better than a kind of top-down view. So that can feel, it's easy to say and harder to do. But I think generally, working locally, some of the work in my local community here, you start to work locally and it's much cheaper because, you're using some voluntary work, you're combining services, you're combining the private sector with the non-profit sector, with the government sector. It can be woven together. It's about relationships, it's about trust, and it kind of works, because there'll be a meeting room here that somebody offers or a project there that somebody can bring in. I'm a big fan of working locally, but moving towards this idea of how do we connect all that up, across projects and learning and influence upwards.
Yeah, no, that feels really relatable. And I think too that idea, like everything's so interconnected, so that working on all the things kind of all at once, but also kind of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that kind of destabilization kind of as a signal that things need to shift and change is something I think we're all dealing with. And I love that kind of statement of weaving together our intentions so that we understand where are we going and where are we headed and how do we go together in those things. It kind of leads me to my next question, because I think in a lot of ways, we're looking to control things and understand this complexity in complex systems. Stability actually isn't about control. It's about facilitating movement, diversity, and adaptability. I am curious to get your thoughts on how we reframe the way we think about creating lasting change in our communities.
Well, I think there's a couple of aspects to that. We talked about this. I think that there are times when you're working locally, or when you start to really apprehend or get to grips with what's going on in a systemic way, i.e., and I didn't say that particularly, but the root cause thing is really important. What's the historical perspective? Where have these things come from? Some of these patterns have come from a long, they're very embedded, and other things are more new. But it's really interesting that you have to ask the question, I think, both what do we preserve, what do we support, what do we make more resilient, but also sometimes what really do we have to challenge, hard, and try and break down and, destabilize. And I think that's a kind of interesting. So when I talk about courageous, it is sometimes about speaking truth to power, and it is about standing up for things and saying, this is not the right way to do this. We're not going along with this. We have to challenge upwards and challenge those around us, and not just kind of work within things that really don't matter. I had this talk with, in one setting, I was talking to a lot of health professionals, and at the end of it, one woman came up to me and she said, I'm 50 years old. She said, I come to work and I feel I've got to go along with things that I think are completely stupid and a waste of time. She said, I don't do that in my private life. She said, that's it. I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not going along with things that are nonsense or even make things worse. I'm going to be more challenging. So that's kind of one aspect of it. But I think creating lasting change is about resilience and adaptation as well. It's having this idea about, well, we're making things better now, but how do we embed in that ability to really keep adapting into the future? How do we make sure in our management style and in the way that we're working with communities that we keep saying, so what will happen in 5 years' time? How can we embed the ability to flex this? When will we know if things still have to adapt? So it's kind of talking about this idea of resilience. And sometimes the quick fix is something that Taoists are very keen on. If I want to do something quick as a leader, I say, do this. I've thought about this, do this, it'll work. But if I want to embed a lasting change, I've got to allow you to some extent to try things, to experiment, to support you in challenging me to co-create this idea of what we should be doing. So it's a different style of working with, either as a leader or as a facilitator, where you're constantly thinking about, I'm trying to embed the confidence in people to think about what to do in the future or to be willing to stand up and challenge. So that's a subtle difference, and it's very easy to think, oh, well, we'll just tell people what to do and then we'll measure it, as opposed to engender that kind of maturing of style and stance.
Yeah, I love that idea of maturing, that we're growing and that progression within the adaptation and resilience and taking those moments to challenge. I'm wondering if you can just chat a little bit more about kind of cultivating some of that awareness around how we observe patterns or notice shifts. Like what are we practicing in that?
So if I was going to work with a new community, a new organization, or even, rocking up at a conference in Banff, I've got to kind of attune to the flow and the norms of what's there. So partly that is almost like a personal practice of noticing with the whole of my body, in an intuitive way. It's a difficult word in intuition, but how if I'm quiet for a bit, I'm kind of take it in. I'm trying to understand how things happen here. I might ask some questions if I'm, like talking to a conference. Let me listen to how other people are speaking. Let me ask some questions about what goes on here. What's the background to this conference? There's a researching diagnostic phase to understanding what is there. I think there's also a need, if I'm trying to understand the history, the root causes, what's going on, I'm wanting to ask many questions of many people, but I'm also want many perspectives. So I would work with kind of a steering group of people from different levels, from different backgrounds, maybe from people. I always like, for example, in working with organisations to see if I can work with customers or suppliers or recipients or people who used to work in the organisation, because you'll get a different narrative and a different feel. So I'm trying to bring together many perspectives, and I'm also then trying to work with multiple perspectives on, so what does this mean? What's here? What matters? What should we do? So I've always got this idea of there are patterns and things changing, but I won't be able to just get there on my own. I certainly do use hard data. It isn't like I don't look at the data. It's just sometimes the data hides some of the real pathways, both pathways that have happened and pathways that could happen. But that kind of more tentative, subjective, I use the word critical subjectivity, in the sense of it's not just going, oh, well, everybody's opinion works. It's all relative. It's not a relative view. It's being critically subjective. Like, well, it is a subjective view, but are we honing in on something? Are we starting to kind of agree because there's something really there, And sometimes you have this like, yes, that really matters here. That's really key, or that's a really important constituent of this kind of understanding that's coming from the past. You have a sort of sometimes a collective felt sense of it. And I think we need to hone those kind of skills in people, as well as just thinking everything's kind of open to logical analysis.
Maybe you can share the perspective on the time it takes to do that, because I think that's something that we talk about a lot. And I think there's sometimes a real struggle in that balance between measurement and hard data and the narrative, and really probing at those questions in a critically subjective way so we can find those paths forward. And I'm just curious what your association is with the time it takes to do those things.
Well, I think the time comes in building trusted relationships earlier on. So I was thinking about, I went on a workshop this last weekend, which was to do with the use of poetry in creating change and an understanding of the way the world is, with a view to tackling some of these big issues. And it was, by the time we'd spent a couple of days together as a group and we were starting to get to know each other better, I noticed that we started to go, oh, yes, that really works, or that's really important. And I think it can often be, it's not a slow process. It's when you trust each other and you have enough challenge in the room. It's this thing about the balance between, we don't all want to have groupthink or be alike, but if you can build trust, you start to say, you know what, that really matters. Now you can still go and check it out with some data. You might have some hypotheses that come out of that. And you say, well, let's just check that out. But there's also something in complexity thinking, which is about sometimes you don't know until you try. So the idea of there's no right answer, but we've honed in on something that's a good starting point. So let's try it and see what happens. We can always refine it and review it. Now, here's a couple of starting points. You go and try that with your team over there. I'll try this with my project over here. Let's get back together again and see what we learned and what works. It's more that sort of idea, more tentative, but in sometimes some ways faster. I remember a colleague of mine said, instead of going ready, aim, fire, you go ready, fire, aim, which is a bit of a weird way to put it, but it's a bit like try it and see, and you'll get more information. I actually think it's quicker and more. It's also quicker because people feel empowered. It's like, oh, yes, I can see this, I'm going to do it, rather than going away thinking, well, I don't really know. There's no right answer in a complex world. There's wrong answers, but you're homing in on something. And by acting, you're actually changing the future anyway. So it's a more co-evolving, co-creative process.
The notion of belonging within what's happening leads to my next question here of, that idea if we're always becoming and co-creating the future with our actions and intentions. As you look ahead, what gives you hope about our collective capacity to navigate the complex and fast changing world we live in and make those meaningful waves?
I think many people are feeling quite despondent on a global level at the moment. I mean, I have rarely felt things have been quite so scary politically, economically. There are many challenges in the world today, and they are interrelated. You have to talk about energy to talk about climate change, and the increasing rates of inequality mean that if we do have growth, a lot of that money gets siphoned off by the super incredibly, unbelievably rich. Meanwhile, the poor are getting poorer. It's that inequality is rising, and there's no benefit other than the economic growth is affecting the climate, but it's not really making the world very much better for the people, for more and more people who have to go to food banks and are really struggling. It's a depressing picture on one level if you look at all those systemic factors. And yet, we never know. One of the things about complexity is it's giving us a scientific picture, which is the past and the present do shape the future, but not in a deterministic way. And sometimes it isn't entirely obvious, but things are unraveling, things are changing in ways that haven't kind of risen to the surface yet. And if you think about the end of slavery or the end of apartheid, or how Nelson Mandela must have felt in prison for 22 years, he would have not expected ever to get out, and he certainly wouldn't have ever expected to be president heading the end of apartheid. So what gives me hope in a way is that, so on the one hand, what gives me hope is that you never know. It's worth trying. And there's a guy called Clive Hamilton, I talk about this right at the end of my book, who talked about this idea of active fatalism. We look at the world around us, we look at our situations, and we think, golly, this is awful. I feel, there's one argument that's like, what's the point? What can I do anyway? Who am I? But you never know. It might just be you that makes a difference. And even if you can't know, and even if it's probably the most probable thing is it's hard to make a difference, it doesn't mean it's not possible. And I think sometimes what I do is I look at the quality of the next step I take. Like, well, I'm here now. How can I do this next thing with integrity, with authenticity, with my full heart and mind, in service of other people, in service of the future? If I concentrate on this that is in my control, which is my next step, and, with the future in mind and taking opportunities to influence or step into other things, that's what gives me hope. Maybe my little act won't do anything, but maybe somebody on a train who's in a real position of power overheard me having a conversation or was impressed by something I did, and it caused them to change what they did. You never know. So it still gives me hope, both in the future, in the power of compassion. At the end of the day, and some of the people writing about the end of very corrupt regimes, very unequal regimes that we've had in the past, in the end, people have nothing to lose and they rise. They find ways of getting together, they find ways of creating change, and things change. It can feel sometimes that things will never change and will go on forever, but history shows us that they do. And I'm attracted to this idea. Some of the people who've influenced me the most have never lost their heart and soul in the way that they work. They've had faith in themselves in some way, that you keep walking the path, you keep co-creating the path of the future in the best way you can, with your full heart. And you never know. That's what gives me hope.
Yeah, thank you for that. You really never know. I love that. I'm in our conversation, I'm just left thinking about so many things, whether it's, kind of that assumptions that we hold about the way the world works and, really thinking about what we need to be more curious about, or that openness to embracing that uncertainty so that we can open ourselves up to these new possibilities, and that reminder that you never know the impact you're going to make. So just go and do it. Is there any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Don't worry about the science of complexity and all these kind of things. That's where I've come from. Believe in your experience. Believe in Indigenous wisdom. Believe in what you see about you. Don't go along with things that don't work. Trust yourself. Trust each other. Build relationships. Do your best. It's not, this science isn't the thing. It's find people who work with integrity, who are inspiring, who work with good heart, who you trust. Take the opportunity to give your colleagues and, to build time, to get to know them, to build the ground for these things, value difference, notice opportunities. It's a practice, I think, that you don't necessarily have to study complexity science. It's been part of my route in it, but it's also reinforced things I thought anyway. It's a kind of soulful, spiritual practice in a way. So just that, trust yourselves, trust in goodness, do your best and keep moving, because the path is made by walking. We collectively co-create the future. It's not set out. And we must do our best to seed that with the best ingredients that we can. That would be my final thoughts, I think.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I love that. Trust yourself, believe in the experience that you have, and walk the path. Fantastic. We also always like to close out with kind of a fun question. So I was just curious, what are you reading right now?
Oh my goodness. I have got completely entranced by a writer called Ursula Le Guin. She was writing, she's an American science fiction and fantasy writer who started publishing in the 1960s. And I think she is fantastic. I've just been reading a novella called The Word for World is Forest. She looks at, and this was written in, I think, the 1970s, she looks at different ways of acting. She contrasts, she looks at issues to do with the climate. She looks at the role of the unconscious. She looks at the importance of relationships. And she even has one of the leading figures in there is a kind of, she gets into the mind of a sociopathic leader that we may be able to think of one or two spring to mind. And I love, that's a story that really brings alive how you can think about different political traditions, different ways of being, and understand how people can get locked into these tight patterns of power and believing in themselves, and not caring about anybody else. So I'm reading that and I really recommend it. I love it. If I end up on a desert island, I'm definitely taking the collected works with me.
Fantastic. I will have to check that out because I was not familiar before now. So Jean, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and sitting with us today. And thank you.
Not at all. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Awesome. And for all of our listeners, to learn more about Jean and her work, please go check out embracingcomplexity.com for free content videos. And of course, the link to her latest book, The Tao of Complexity. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Poverty. Subscribe, check out more episodes on enough4all.ca, and follow us on social at Vibrant Calgary. Thanks for listening. Thank you.